Today, we have Evan Thomas, the author of 10 books, including the New York Times bestseller John Paul Jones, books on Robert Kennedy, Nixon. He was a writer, correspondent, and editor for 33 years at Time and Newsweek, including 10 years as the Washington bureau chief for Newsweek. He's appeared on Meet the Press, Washington Week, Morning Joe, and a lot of other programming. He's taught writing and journalism at Harvard and Princeton, where at Princeton he was from 2007 to 2014 Ferris Professor of Journalism. O.C. Thomas is an alumna of Stanford and the University of Virginia Law School. She was a lawyer with a litigation firm in New York and later a vice president of AT&T. And they'll be in conversation with Colleen Shogan, who's Assistant Deputy Librarian for Collections and Services. She's also the Library of Congress's designee on the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission, and where she now serves as Vice Chair. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Great. Thanks, John, and we're honored to have you both joining us on stage here today. We're going to have a conversation, and then we're going to turn it over to Q&A from the audience. So save up your questions for the end of the program. To start out, you've written a really diverse set of books. You've written books on Richard Nixon, the CIA, Robert Kennedy, John Paul Jones. Why now move to Sandra Day O'Connor? Why did you write this book at this moment in time?
Because the family asked me. The background on this is that Justice O'Connor wrote a wonderful book called The Lazy Bee about growing up on a ranch in Arizona, and it sold pretty well. So Random House was after her for years to do her memoirs. And I was brought in as a Random House author with a law degree. I was brought in about 5 years ago to maybe be a ghostwriter for her. And I spent a day with her, and I could tell she wasn't all that eager. Because, I'm guessing at this, she absolutely wanted to be remembered and to have all that. But she's a very private person, and I could just tell that she didn't really want to spill the beans about her own life. I'm sensing this. It's nothing that she said. And then it went away. But then Justice O'Connor got the early stages of Alzheimer's, of dementia. And the family said, what do we do now? And so they came to me through Random House and said, would you do this if we give you access to the papers and to her and to the clerks and all that? And I said, sure. And we had O.C. and I, my wife, who worked very closely on this with me all the way through. We just had a wonderful time getting to know. When we first met her, she had early stage, she could still talk, but she was repeating herself. Now, sadly, she's pretty far gone.
So before we get into Sandra Day O'Connor's life and the book, tell us a little bit about how you two worked together on these books. Now, how long have you been married?
44 years.
Okay, so obviously it works, the collaboration works on the books, but tell us how you worked together on this particular book.
Well, you answer that.
I worked full time until 2000, and then I started helping Evan, principally editing his books and doing some research, and I got increasingly involved. But when this project came up, it was so exciting. First woman justice on the Supreme Court. I'd been a young lawyer when she was nominated. I'd gone to Stanford. I was from the West. And it was a wonderful way for Evan and me to spend time. Authors often have a lot of time to themselves, and when you work as closely with someone, it's just more fun. So we did all of the interviews and the research in this building together, and we would see Jeff sitting back there, who was just absolutely wonderful, the head of the manuscript division, and in her chambers at the Supreme Court and traveling, and we ended up interviewing 94 clerks and 350 people altogether, and 7 justices, and really having a very special window into her life.
I can't say enough about the Library of Congress. I mean, we really spent days down under Jeff's expert tutelage in the reading room downstairs. And what a fantastic national resource Jeff is, but also the library is. So we're especially glad to be here. The other thing I would add is that we complement each other because I write very quickly. I wrote on deadline I've written 100 Newsweek cover stories, but I'm hasty and impulsive. And Osi is a lawyer, a real lawyer. I'm a graduate from law school, but she's a real lawyer. And very logical and has that lawyerly, analytical mind that would catch my logical inconsistencies and force me to explain things that I was writing about. So we're very complementary as writers.
The book starts and really ends with the Lazy Bee Ranch, which you referred to earlier. Describe the Lazy Bee Ranch in Arizona for us, and why was it so influential in Sandra Day O'Connor's life?
We went there together. Also, you just described the physical place.
The family sold the ranch, I think in the late 1990s, but this is a ranch of 160,000 acres of high desert, arid, bleak, beautiful. And the family that bought the ranch allowed Sandra's brother Alan to take us back and see what life was like there. It was still as if time stopped. The house is there, the pastures are there, the windmills are there. They're actually not functioning. They've been electrified, but they powered their wells by wind. And that's significant. Evan will talk about that later. But so the ranch, she was born in El Paso, but went back to the ranch, and she had cowboys for playmates. She was the first child, another 9 years before another baby came, and there was no running water, no electricity. The house was 8 miles from the main road. They thought of it as their own country, she said.
The dominant figures were mom and dad. There wasn't anybody else. And Mr. Day was a very dominating, powerful figure. He was adoring. He loved his daughter, but he could come on pretty strong. And the story that she liked to tell is that when she was 15, her job was to make lunch and take it to the roundup, way out on the prairie. So she gets up at 5 a.m., she cooks the roast, she makes the cake, she loads up the truck, she has a flat tire. She's a slender girl, and so she has to jump on the jack to change it. She gets there, and her father looks at her, and he says, "You're late." She said, "Well, Dad, I had to change a tire." And he said, "Next time, leave earlier." Now, she liked to tell that story to her law clerks. No excuses. She learned self-reliance, but she learned something else from her mother, which I think was really the most critical thing. Her mom was a very elegant woman. On this dusty ranch, once a bath, once a week, wore dresses, perfume, hose, good shoes, subscribed to Vogue. But much more important than that, Sandra watched as her mother dealt with her father. Mr. Day could have a drink or two in the evening and be a bit of a bully. And Sandra's mom had a way of she was not passive. She was not rolled. She was not, just giving up. But on the other hand, she didn't get into stupid fights. She knew when to stand up to him and when to walk away. That was something that Sandra Day O'Connor really had Sandra Day O'Connor had to deal with a lot of obnoxious males in her career, and she handled them. And I think she learned a lot watching her mother and father.
When she was a junior at Stanford, she decided she wanted to go to law school, and she would enter law school early. Why did she decide on law when at that point in time in American history it was completely a male-dominated profession?
She went to college at 16, so she was 19 years old when she entered law school at Stanford. And at Stanford, at a number of schools across the country, you could do your 4th undergraduate year as a first-year law student if you had a certain grade point average and passed a test, and that's how she became one of 5 women entering a class of 150 people at Stanford. And she had an undergraduate professor named Harry Rathbun that had a big influence on her. She would actually go with a number of students to his house on Sunday nights and sit on his oriental carpets, and he would talk about how individuals could make a difference in the world and how women should take their place in the world. And he was faculty in the law school teaching in the undergraduate program, and I think he was the principal reason, she later said he was the principal reason that she got interested in the law.
She also took a course called Western Civilization that absolutely made her. We have the feel of this because we had access to her papers, and we had her final exam written as a 17-year-old girl.
On those blue books, remember? Blue books.
Yeah, in a blue book. And it's a real brilliant exegesis on Jefferson and Madison and the rule of law. And unfortunately, they don't teach that course at Stanford anymore because it's considered to be too hegemonic and patriarchal and all that stuff. But boy, it sure stood by Sandra Day O'Connor.
When she was in law school, she met William Rehnquist, which I think a lot of people who read the book were very surprised about this. Could you talk about the nature of their relationship and why this was influential for the rest of her career?
She and Bill Rehnquist were classmates. They were on the law review together. They were moot court partners. And from April to December, their first year, they dated. He was an ardent boyfriend. When he joined the when he was on the Supreme Court and her name came up as a possible justice, he allowed it's how they'd gone to the movies together and nothing more. So in any event, we were in the Supreme Court building. We had told the family we hadn't found any love letters at the Library of Congress. Fabulous as the collection is, the love letters weren't here, and where were they? And in a box at the Supreme Court in her personal storage, marked correspondence, we found wonderful love letters between her and her husband, John, who had been a year behind her in law school. But we found 14 love letters from Bill Rehnquist to Sandra Day from 1952. He's back in Washington. He's clerking on the Supreme Court. She's finishing up her third year. And letter 7 says, "Sandy, will you marry me?" So
That was our little scoop. I gave up a very undignified yelp when I read that letter. Amazingly, they did not, she did not, and he did not, she did not, I'm sure, tell her own family. Not even her husband, I'm pretty sure. The good news is they became great friends. This, although her answer was no, but she strung him along for a couple of months, waiting for John. But then we know from the letters, they bonded again, and they had really a wonderful friendship down through the years in Phoenix and then on the court.
So she goes on to marry John O'Connor. Tell us a little bit about their relationship. It's a good part of the book. And why did she settle? She had many suitors, actually, as you outlined. Yeah. Why did she settle on him?
He made her laugh. That is one of the great things in their marriage. They had and he was not like her father. He did not want to dominate her. He supported her. Because they were on the law review together, in fact, they had met when they were fact-checking a law review article over a period of 40 days. They went out on a date. He knew how smart she was, and he respected that. So he wanted her to shine, and he would promote her, and then he would make her laugh. And I think that's really much the heart of their relationship.
It was a great and lasting marriage.
Why did President Reagan decide to nominate Sandra Day O'Connor to the court? Did he decide that he was going to nominate a female justice? And how did he learn about Sandra Day O'Connor? Because at that moment in time, she was on the Arizona Court of Appeals.
Pure politics. October 1980, Governor Reagan, running for president, is 10 points behind in the polls and with women in the state of Illinois, a swing state. A political aide says to him, we got to do something about the gender gap. And so what they did, right off the top of his head, was to promise to put one of the first, name as one of his first Supreme Court appointees a woman. Just political. And over at the Justice Department, once he won at the Attorney General's office, they thought it wasn't serious. They thought that Reagan would nominate, they were hoping he would nominate Bob Bork, a strong conservative, to begin the process of rolling back the liberal excesses of the Warren Court. Remember, it's the Reagan Revolution. But that's not what happened. The Attorney General came to his aides and said, he's serious, the president's serious. Unless we can't find a woman, we're going to nominate one. Now, that actually was a little trickier than it seems, because in 1980, the law was still very male. Of the 600 federal judges, only 8 were women. And they were almost all liberal Democrats appointed by Jimmy Carter. There just weren't. There's one other Republican Federal Court of Appeals judge, Cornelia Kennedy, they interviewed. But they liked Justice O'Connor much better. They heard about Justice O'Connor from a variety of sources, one of which was the Chief Justice. I got to know her over one weekend. No, actually, I was referring to Berger. Rehnquist.
Right, wasn't the Chief Justice yet.
Rehnquist secretly did promote her. Yes, that was, in fact, Ken Starr, who was the guy leading the search, who was then a special assistant to the Attorney General leading the search, said that the most important voice was Rehnquist, but also the Chief Justice Berger knew her, and he promoted her, Barry Goldwater. So she had some friends in court. And really, she was really the only choice.
And when she met President Reagan, they talked mostly about ranching. And he was delighted with her personality and her presence, and he knew she was smart. So he was, and also Jim Baker told Evan that you can be sure Nancy Reagan was for it.
So when Sandra Day O'Connor arrived at the court, how was she received by the 8 sitting justices as the first female Supreme Court justice? Did they welcome her with open arms? Did she find the court to be an enlightened place, welcoming of a woman?
No. It was literally cold, literally as well as figuratively. It's marble. And she would go out, and she missed the sunshine. She would step out in those interior courtyards and turn her face up to the sun. Her first lunch, the justices get together for lunch once or twice a week. Only 4 other justices even came. Justices, they're appointed for life. That doesn't mean they have to like each other. And they sometimes don't. And so we talked to Justice Stevens, who was behind the movement to drop the Mr. before Justice, right before they came on the court. I mean, talk about a male place. The Supreme Court had been all male for 200 years. And Stevens told us they had this dilemma because the duties of the junior justice include taking notes and getting coffee. So they said, well, traditionalists, we should ask her to get coffee, but they actually didn't. Now, she's a brave woman, but in her very first oral argument, she knows everybody's watching her, and after about a half an hour, she starts to speak up to ask a question, and the idiot lawyer arguing the case talked over her. You can hear it on tape.
He said, "Let me finish."
Let me finish. And she wrote in her diary that night, I feel put down. Now, that's very unusual. Feeling put down is not a feeling Sandra O'Connor had for very long. And,
well, I think she did have allies. So Lewis Powell, a very courtly man, wrote his family letters fairly frequently. They're a wonderful resource. And he said, wrote them within 3 weeks saying, she is nothing short of brilliant. I think she'll make her mark on this court. He had befriended her. He'd seen that her office was a little disorganized, and he'd given her a secretary to organize from his office to help organize her office, and they became friends. And but it still the case, that she had to navigate her way. But it took a little while, but by the end of the second term, her husband was writing on her in his diary that she feels like she's in the catbird seat.
Talk a little bit about her work in gender in the law, and did Sandra Day O'Connor consider herself a feminist?
That's an interesting question because she was a feminist, but she did not use the word feminist. She did as much to advance women's rights as anybody alive. One thing, she had preserved abortion rights for 25 years, counter to what people expected of her. She's the decisive voice and moving thing in Casey, which is now still a law of the land, 1992 case. But she also had a very significant women's rights case in her very first term about whether men could go to the University of Mississippi nursing school, gender rights case. She worked with Justice Ginsburg on these cases. In fact, one of Justice Ginsburg's most famous case is the Virginia VMI case, Could You Have a Single-Sex College? The opinion was written by Justice Ginsburg, but the opinion was actually assigned to Justice O'Connor, and she, in the conference room, said, no, I think Ruth should have this. That never happens. The Supreme Court justice says, no, I don't want to take this opinion. Joe should have it. That just doesn't happen. But she did that for Ruth because that's the kind of person she was.
Justice Ginsburg had just arrived on the court, and she really appreciated that. But Sandra O'Connor was there on her own for the first 11 years or so. And so back in Arizona, going back to her role as the first female Senate Majority Leader in the country of a state Senate, she did not, she made it her business after it was clear that the ERA amendment didn't have the votes in the legislature. She made it her business to inventory and change every law in the state that discriminated against women. So she had her eye
She made
always.
a list. She made a list of them. We saw it in her handwriting. This is revealing of her style, and it goes to the question. She introduced the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, in the legislature for passage. It had passed Congress. It was moving through the states, and then she let it die in committee. And the feminists were furious. The activists were furious at her. You betrayed us. You're selling us out. You must be doing this for a federal judgeship. And she kept quiet about that. Now, why did she do that? She didn't have the votes. Why waste your time having a big show of virtue when you don't have the votes?
Because Phyllis Schlafly.
Remember Phyllis Schlafly? She was in town campaigning against the ERA, and she had beaten back. The ERA had been non-controversial, amazingly, in the late 60s, but by the early 70s, every revolution creates a counter-revolution. The women's rights movement, women's lib, remember that, produced a counter-revolution. Phyllis Schlafly and the right and the moral majority. And so politically, she couldn't get it done, so she didn't do it. Instead, quietly, she amended every single law in the state of Arizona that discriminated against women. And there were a lot of them. You couldn't own property, you couldn't get a credit card with your husband's permission, you couldn't own a house. The laws were incredibly weighted against women locally. She changed every single one.
So this dovetails nicely. You describe her jurisprudence as pragmatic in the book, and you also call her a judicial minimalist. What do you mean by those terms, and how do you answer her critics who say that she was unprincipled as a jurist?
She does have a lot of critics. The law reviews don't love her. She did not operate from sweeping principles or doctrines, which made her a little unpredictable. And of course, lower courts and law professors like predictability, and so it can seem a little arbitrary. If you don't have any overriding principle, then maybe it's just the seat of your pants that's guiding you. So that's the criticism. Her answer to that is that she believed the law should that the court should pay attention to the practical consequences of their actions. She worried about unintended consequences. And she believed the law should move slowly and incrementally and minimally. This is why they called her a minimalist. Her decisions were very narrow, very fact-based, particularly on the social issues. She wanted to inch the law and never get too far ahead of the public or too far behind, but be very sensitive to that. And the other piece of this, and she didn't articulate this, Dan Bassell, but talk about Dan Bassell's.
He's one of her clerks. He's a professor at UCLA, and he had a wonderful way of describing her sense that the Supreme Court was really not the final word in most cases, and it was instead in an ongoing conversation with the Congress, with the state legislatures, saying to them, and with the lower courts, saying to them, try again. This doesn't pass muster in a constitutional level, but try again. We'll deal with it if you send it back to us, but you can do better. And this was, I think, a very successful philosophy for her, because she ended up being the swing vote in 330 cases on the court, and in time the media was calling it the O'Connor court.
330 decisive votes, that's a lot of power. The most illustrative, I'm going to talk for a little bit about abortion and
Sure.
affirmative action, because they go to this. When she first came on the court, Harry Blackmun, who wrote Roe v. Wade, the court's abortion decision in 1973, thought, oh my God, she's a Reagan appointee, she's going to vote to overturn abortion. And in her early cases, she's a critic of Roe v. Wade. She ends up saving Roe v. Wade because in 1992, there are actually 5 votes to overturn Roe v. Wade, to end the constitutional right to abortion. O'Connor, and this is all her brilliant human instinct. It's a bit of a convoluted story, but I want to tell it because it so goes to who she is. On the court by 1992, Justice Scalia was becoming a force. And the brand new justice was Justice Tony Kennedy. And they were friends, they were neighbors, fellow Catholics, and the thought was, Scalia is going to lead Kennedy to be the decisive vote to overturn Roe v. Wade. Scalia made the classic mistake of patronizing Kennedy. The clerk started joking about little Nini, they called Kennedy, using derisive terms for him. Kennedy's a proud guy, and he didn't like it. And O'Connor sensed this and was able to peel Kennedy away from Scalia on the Casey case secretly. They had a secret troika with Justice Souter working behind the scenes, very unusual, cutting the clerks out. And the effect was to preserve abortion rights with a different standard that's very typical of her. The states could restrict abortion, but they cannot put what's called an undue burden on a woman's right to abortion. Well, what does that mean? Took a lot of cases to sort this out. The abortion advocates didn't love this, but it's a lot better than losing abortion rights altogether, which was about to happen had O'Connor and Souter not gotten Justice Kennedy away from the majority to do that. And she did it because she had great human fingertips. She was willing to compromise. Her decision is still being fought over, and it's frustrating, but it gives you a sense for her political fingertips.
You mentioned the law clerks, and you said you interviewed over 90 law clerks, and they play a big part in this book. Why did you focus on her law clerks so much, and what did they bring to the story? What were they able to tell you about Sandra Day O'Connor and her time on the court?
Every justice has 4 law clerks. That's by custom, and they have a lot of work to do on the court. They often write the drafts of the opinions. In her case, they do, and they work for a year, and they work 18-hour days, weekends, every weekend, no vacation, because their workload is so great. It is such an honor to be a Supreme Court clerk. It puts you at the top of the legal profession. And she chose them very carefully, not for their ideology. She was very happy to have conservatives, liberals. What she cared about was, if you don't agree with the way I decide a case, can you still write it the way I decide? What she cared about was that they get along with each other and get along with her. She wanted sort of a cohesion in her courtroom, in her chambers, and she really got it. So her clerks, she cared about, she knew they were super smart. She liked something different about them. One of them had swum the English Channel. One of them was a classical pianist. Another one was had been a boat person out of Vietnam. She had something special about them.
First blind clerk, first
Yeah.
disabled clerk.
Right. And so she would take them on outings. She knew they were going to be in Washington for only a year. And even though they had this tremendous workload, she wanted them to see the cherry blossoms. Cherry blossoms would be at their height, and she'd come in, might be raining, and she'd say, put on your jackets, we're going to go march down to the tidal basin. And they'd say, but you want this memo by tomorrow, or shall we go with you? And she'll say, you have to come with me, and yes, I want the memo tomorrow. And sure enough, they'd spend all night working on it. She thought that they needed, she could help them learn how to live a balanced life, and she would give them, one of the clerks told us, life lessons. Be kind to others. Give good dinner parties. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Go out and go to museums and broaden your life. Get exercise. The women had to go to an aerobics class, and I should have said she always hired 2 women. She knew that that was key to enlarging the number of women at the top of the legal profession. And she would say to them, she would take them once to the Arboretum in Washington, and one of them, Stuart Branner, also at UCLA professor, said to us, this wasn't stopping to smell the roses, it was speeding up to smell the roses and learning how to be a better rose smeller. So she worked them very hard. She gave praise very seldom. They knew they were doing a good job if they didn't hear criticism. They Xeroxed a copy of her hand, and they put it on a wall, and they said, if you want a pat on the back, lean here. The story I love is one of her male clerks, because they had to stay in shape too, said he was eating an ice cream cone one day at his desk, and he saw her coming, and he opened his drawer and stuck the cone in.
Did Sandra Day O'Connor become more liberal over time as a justice? And if she did, why?
Slightly. We asked Justice Stevens, do you think that Justice O'Connor moved to the left? And he said yes. And we said why? And his answer was Justice Scalia. He was half kidding. Scalia was annoying to her. But interestingly, she didn't shoot back. He said to her about her abortion decision, it, quote, can't be taken seriously. He said that publicly. Mm-hmm. When the clerks would write in her opinion zingers aimed at Scalia, she would take them out. She was always avoided public fights. But I think she did measurably move a little bit to the left, particularly on cases where women and children were involved. You can see it. The most famous one that comes to mind is the soccer mom case, and it's illustrative of her. The issue was a mother's driving along with her kids. She gets arrested for not having her license, I think it was. Seatbelts. She gets put in jail. A little extreme. But the issue before the court is, can you be jailed for a misdemeanor? Yes, under English common law and the Constitution you can. So there's the Justice Souter, I think, wrote the majority opinion. She dissented because she got into the record and she saw that the policeman had humiliated this woman in front of her children and that there was some cost to that, to the kids. And she saw that if the cops can put you in jail for no seatbelts or something like that, that's going to be used for racial profiling. And so she dissented in that case.
Why did she side with the majority in Bush v. Gore?
That's a tangled tale. But let me try here. You all remember Bush v. Gore? Like, you know, how could you forget? So it looked, you know, the Supreme Court, when the case bubbles up to the Supreme Court, there's a recount going on, and the Supreme Court stops the recount. The effect is to elect George Bush. Now, the 5 votes to stop the recount are all conservative Republicans, every one of them. And the 4 votes who want the recount to continue are Democrats and liberals. So it looks nakedly political. It's a bad moment for the court. It looks like, you know, the court does not like to be seen as a political institution. It may be, but it certainly doesn't want to be seen that way. And so this is just raw and naked. Now, she's a Republican, she is, and she wanted Bush to win, she did. But I think what's really driving her here, and I got this partly from Justice Ginsburg, who was on the other side, was that she's a very practical person, I mentioned that. And she's looking down the road, and she realizes that if the recount continues, you could have a real car wreck that would work this way. If the recount continues, now you have to remember, Katherine Harris, the Florida Secretary of State, has already certified the Republican victory. So there's already a set of electors from the state of Florida. The recount goes on. Let's say Gore wins, there are going to be 2 sets of electors. Under the law, 3 U.S. Code 15, if there are 2 sets of electors, believe it or not, there's a law for this, it goes to Congress. The House has 1 vote, and the Senate has 1 vote. Now, the House was going to be Republican, the Senate was going to be Democratic, a tie. Under the law, in the case of a tie, the tie is broken by the governor of the state. His name was Jeb Bush. And so she could see it was going to look like a banana republic. The guy's brother got him elected in January. And she said, we're not going to do that. Let's stop it now. Let's take the hit. And they did take a hit. And deservedly, the opinion is not, the Supreme Court does not like to do things in 3 days, which is how quickly they did this. And the opinion's pretty ugly in the view of many scholars. The court's per curiam opinion written by Justice Kennedy with a lot of input by Justice O'Connor. And it's a one-time precedent, and you know, but her view again is very practical. Let's the Supreme Court step in here, take the hit, and move on.
She later said to the Chicago Tribune in 2013, maybe we shouldn't have taken the case. That's a long time later. She did get, for many years, some comfort, if you will, that the court had not actually elected Bush because the 3 different occasions the media organizations did an actual recount using those very ballots, hiring statistical firms, accounting firms to do the work. And one of the consortiums was the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, the LA Times, sort of unassailable credentials for these people. And every time the recount came out with Bush having fewer votes than Katherine Harris had certified, but still winning. Katherine Harris had certified 537 votes. The margin narrowed to 200 votes. Imagine this. So the lesson is, if you're in a swing state, go vote, because it matters.
O'Connor left the court in 2005 at a relatively young age. Why did she leave the court in 2005, and did she later regret her decision?
She left the court because her husband, her beloved husband, John, had Alzheimer's. He'd gotten it, the symptoms started showing up maybe 10 years before, and it's a progressive disease, and he was getting worse and worse. She was taking him to her chambers. But among the symptoms of Alzheimer's can be that you can't sleep. John and Sandra slept in the same bed, so if he wasn't sleeping, she wasn't sleeping. And it just got harder and harder, so she finally resigned. She was explicit about it. He sacrificed for me. John had given up a big law practice in Phoenix, where he'd been the big man and head of the Rotary, chairman of a couple of hospitals and all that, to come to Washington, where his law practice was not successful. He sacrificed for me, so now I'm going to sacrifice for him. And she resigned. The tragedy is that within 6 months of her leaving, he couldn't recognize her. And tell the rest of the story. She had to put him in a memory care home. She has 3 sons, and they were very supportive of her. And
And there he developed what's called a mistaken attachment to a woman who also didn't know who her family was. So he's sitting on the couch in the common area, holding the hand of this woman, and Sandra comes to visit. And she sits down and she holds his other hand. And this is how she was visiting him. And this became public. And she said to the public, I'm happy for him. He was depressed and now he's happier. But to her friends, she said she was heartbroken, and of course she was.
Last question before we go to the audience. So at a time in which we have ideological extremes in the electorate and also our institutions, you've written a book about an ardent moderate. What lessons do you hope those who read the book and read about the life of Sandra Day O'Connor, what do you hope they will take from the book?
Well, her great cause, you might even say her religion, was civility and civics. She had a great faith in civil society and civic society and people being involved in their community and working together. There is no problem that you can't at least address if you're civil with each other. She could be bossy herself. She once summoned the majority leader of the U.S. Senate, Tom Daschle, and the minority leader, Trent Lott, to her chambers and gave them a lecture on being more civil. But she really believed this. She was religious. She was, she went to church, but I would say her real religion was kind of a civic religion of her faith in if you are civil to each other and people work together, it's amazing what you can get done. She lived her life that way. She would be brokenhearted today if she has Alzheimer's, as I said, so I don't know how much she's taken in today. But the last thing she said, her last public statement, was when Merrick Garland was nominated to the court, and the Republicans, her party, were holding him up because they wanted to nominate their own guy if Trump won, if the Republicans won. Her last public statement was, no, come on, confirm him. Let's get on with it. She really did not like to see the rules of comedy breaking down. She wanted to move on, but to move on in a way that was civil.
Terrific. Do we have some questions from the audience for Evan and O.C. Thomas? Okay, right here up front. 2 questions right here. 1 second, if you could wait for the microphone so everybody can hear. Thank you.
Yeah, given all the interviews, the volume, and habituating here at the Library of Congress, et cetera, did you have a storybook? I mean, how did you, and how did you rectify telling a story that you had to put in that might not be a major point? How, was it a Zen journey? How was this done?
Well, it's not our first rodeo. There's no huge magic to it. I mean, you spend years doing it, for one thing. And you learn the story, or you are telling yourself the story as you are learning it. A lot of interviews. We mentioned 350 interviews. I do keep a running, after a while, I start a running chronology. Chronology is your friend here, because it gives you an organizational, and in that chronology, it's sort of like a finding aid. I will, for this event or this year, I will list the sources and some of the anecdotes and some of the points I want to make. Now, it's a loose and fluid thing, because of course it evolves and it changes, but that does keep you from the panic you can feel when you can't remember where the hell did I hear that, and because the amount of information is vast. As Jeff will tell you, there's box after box after box of papers downstairs here, and that's just the beginning. So keeping track of it, you really have to be disciplined about telling yourself the story. One thing I had to do, and Osi and I did this together, she participated in 2,000 cases. She wrote over 600 opinions. The reader's not going to want to read about all that, nor should they. We talked about maybe 40 or 50 cases. So you have to choose. And, I did the big, kind of obvious in a way, abortion, affirmative action, the big cases where she really made a difference. But you have to be selective. Now, of course, people would say you're biasing things by your selectivity, but that's all authors have to make those choices. It really helped to be able to do this at the dining table with OSI, because it's not a lonely business. We're talking about this all the time. What is the story? And where does it take us? And of course, it takes you in different directions. It's not obvious all at once. But over time, with a lot of rewriting and revision and effort, and also just one last thing about this, that we really involve journalists when they write a story generally do not show the story to their sources because it's too complicated. You know, what happens if the source objects? You're on deadline. And there's sort of a rule against it. As a journalist, actually, I violated that rule on hard stories where they were controversial. But I really violated as an historian. For instance, with the clerks, they're under a vow of secrecy to the court, as well as to Justice O'Connor. And so the deal I made with them was that if we're going to quote you on the record in the book, you get to see the whole chapter that you're in before it appears. Now, of course, they would squawk, they would see it, and they'd say, I didn't say that, even if they had said it.
Well, they didn't say that.
You know, but you end up learning, it's a net plus, because even though they might object to the particular locution, they end up telling you more, really, because they trust you.
Yeah.
They trust you, and they should, because you're trying to get at the truth. That's a very cumbersome process. You know, that's 94 manuscripts going out. We had the book read by two Federal Court of Appeals judges, by the Dean of the University of Virginia Law School, by legal experts.
By our old con law professor.
By our old con law
Wonderful
professor,
guy.
J. Harvey Wilkinson. So it's a very elaborate process which discloses a lot of mistakes, produces a lot of mistakes. Doesn't catch all of them. We caught a few since publication, but it catches a lot of them. And you get closer to the truth. You never get to the truth. You get closer to it.
I'll tell you one. There's going to be a change in the paperback edition. Justice Ginsburg has been wonderful telling people it's a great book. She said so at the National Book Festival. We were thrilled. But she did write us a letter and say, and this is about a story in the book. Evan had heard from Justice O'Connor's messenger that Justice Ginsburg had hit Justice O'Connor's car in the parking lot twice. And
The first time was a hit and run.
So we waited. We talked to Justice Ginsburg twice, and we waited in her chambers till the very last question, and we said, "Is it true that you hit Justice O'Connor's car?" And she said, "Oh yes, I've never driven again." And she said, I hit her car because I was trying to avoid Justice Scalia's car." So then, but in the book, attributed to the messenger, is that she hit the car twice. So she writes a letter, no, I only hit it once. And she said, but it is true that it took me 5 times to get my driver's license. You can learn more.
Right. One last question. Actually, we'll do 2 if we can be quick. We're right here and then over there. Mm-hmm.
This is an easy one. I was just curious about her education prior to landing at Stanford at 16, and who supported her intelligence early on, and if you know anything about that.
We do. Her parents, her mother especially, thought about homeschooling her, taught her to read, but she was a bright little girl, and the local schools were far away and not good. So they ended up, when she was 6 years old, sending her to her grandmother's house in El Paso, and she grew up going to school in El Paso, living with her grandmother, except for 1 year, 8th grade, when she decided, she said herself, to come back to the ranch and try to take the bus to the local school and see if that would work out. Sort of interestingly, that did not work out, and she went back to her grandmother's after that.
Last question.
I'm wondering how it is that she came to run for the state legislature, and did she or did anyone else talk about how that experience affected her legal career? Because so few justices these days in the contemporary era have that kind of experience.
She and her husband were politically active. He was the head of the Young Republicans in Maricopa County when they first got there. There was a kind of a Republican establishment in Phoenix. They quickly joined it. Barry Goldwater was a neighbor. She was a conservative Republican, and sort of part of civic engagement in Phoenix for them in the early 60s was political engagement, party engagement. In Phoenix, the Republican Party kind of ran Phoenix, and she was part of the elite that did that. And so she was, when there was an opening in the legislature, actually a rare case, there was a woman legislator who got a job in Washington. She filled the vacancy and then ran for office herself. She was elected majority leader, first woman ever of an upper house, because, as one of her aides said there, she was smarter than everybody else. And because she had good political fingertips. She had a great ability to walk away from stupid fights. There's one story I like to tell where she had to deal with Tom Goodwin, who was the House Appropriations Committee chairman and a drunk by 10 a.m. drunk. And she called him on his drinking, and he said, "If you were a man, I'd punch you in the nose." And she said, "If you were a man, you could." Now, that's a great story. I like to tell it, but actually, the important thing about it's a one-off. She very rarely had those kind of confrontations. The men might get into stupid fights, but she didn't, and it gave her a lot more power.
It also informed her jurisprudence on the court because cases would come from the states. And while she was a Federalist and she liked the idea that the states had some autonomy, once in a while she would say, and she did tell one of her clerks, the clerk said, "Should I assume that the states passed this law thinking it would be constitutional?" And she said, "Oh, no, I wouldn't assume that."
She actually said, state legislatures are venal and run by money. Now, she was a Federalist. She did believe in devolving power to the states. She was respectful of state courts and state legislatures, but she was extremely realistic about them, having served in one.
I can't recommend this book enough. We do have books for sale outside from our bookstore if you'd like to purchase them, and there will be a book signing afterwards. Please join me in thanking Evan and O.C. Thomas.
Thank you, Colleen.
Terrific. Thank you.